My own experience with the planning process would have been as a local authority member for quite some time, and in that instance, very, very rarely, but it would happen from time to time, that county councillors would, through whatever mechanisms, vote to overturn recommendations from planners, and that would be considered to be an incredibly serious matter. But the process for that would involve councillors meeting in public session, that the rationale in terms of the proposition to take a different course than recommended would be clearly outlined. The positions of each councillor then would be minuted, and the votes identified in the minutes. It would be extensively reported in local media. There's a very good chance there would be a prime time special, and everybody would know the positions and the rationales, and in the end of the day, local communities could pass judgment on those who had made that decision. So I just want to compare that to get a full understanding of how Bord Pleanála operates. My understanding is that there are 9 members of the board. Is that correct?
Correct, yes. And
that they can meet in teams of 3 to make decisions, and sometimes in the 2 representatives can meet.
The general quorum would be 3 for our decisions. Obviously, there are some cases that we would increase that to a full available board, and then for a smaller scale, for expediency's sake, particularly when we had high levels of appeals coming into us in the late noughties, two persons can be held for small scale applications. Yes.
Okay, but it's important to say that these small scale applications could be people's personal futures in terms of where they live, and so these can be very important at a local level. So the board will meet, they will have the application documents, I take it, and then they will also be furnished with the inspector's report. Is that the way they would operate?
Yes.
And they are authorised, if they so decide, to take a different course of action than the inspector's recommendation. So an inspector can recommend an approval with condition or a refusal, but the board can effectively decide the opposite.
Yes, that is the remit of the board to take on board the recommendation, but to make its decision as a collective. So,
in that instance, are the members of the board who are present noted and minuted publicly?
Yes. So a summary of who attended, the cases that were discussed. If there is a split in the vote, in terms of if there's a divergence of views, that is recorded on the summary notes.
And it's clearly recorded as to which members took which position?
No, just the numbers. So we don't ascribe a view, but it's 2 to 1 or 5 to 4 or whatever it might be.
Okay, so that's the point I was coming to. So if 3 members happen to be in attendance to decide to grant where a recommendation was to refuse, or to refuse where a recommendation was to grant, and 1, it's not clearly outlined which 2 actually voted one way or another.
No, because the board makes the decision as a collective. So, in fact, individual views, the point of having kind of a board of 3 people is that the tribunal comes to a single decision. We record where there is divergence, and indeed where the inspector's recommendation is not taken up, the board actually has to provide evidence and give reasons why it did not accept the inspector. So again, there's a clarity and justification there as to why we diverge from the recommendation.
So how extensive would that rationale explanation need to be, considering you could be dealing with a very extensive inspector's report that could outline the reason for their recommendation? In comparison, how detailed would the minutes be outlining the rationale of the board to take a different course?
Well, it's in the board direction that sets out the justification or the rationale for not accepting the inspector's recommendation. Sometimes it could be on the entirety of the issue, sometimes it could be on a particular condition or element of it. Obviously, the inspector's report will have detailed either a recommendation with conditions and the rationale for that. The board generally addresses those in its in its justification on the direction.
And the board can contravene, if it so wishes, county development plans?
Again, in the context, it can do it in certain circumstances. Certainly in the context of SHD, there's direct provision there where kind of the issue of a contravention has not been identified in the earlier processes. The board sometimes it has restrictions around that, but kind of again, kind of it depends on the type of case and obviously the decision as to whether something is not just a contravention.
I'll just finish on this, Chair. Do you not consider the notion of not outlining which members took which position in these matters to be a difficulty in terms of accountability and transparency when we consider the level of judicial reviews that have been taken and where the board's decision has been overturned? Would it not be prudent for the public to know who is making the decisions that are subsequently being overturned by the judiciary at huge cost to the Irish taxpayer?
Well, Deputy, we are kind of implementing the legislative provisions that are set down in the Planning Act. There is kind of the board makes a collective decision, and I don't think it would actually kind of be appropriate to actually be ascribing different views and individual views to kind of the board has to come to a collective view, and that is actually how kind of it is prescribed down in the planning law.
Walsh, do members of the board, are they required or would it be practice that they would visit the sites of applications they're considering?
Generally, no is the short answer. The inspector obviously will kind of
it was the members of the board. So just come back to my earlier points. This is we'll deal with a refusal by the local authority, but it could well be an approval. But in this case, so you would have a scenario where a type of development is precluded by the county development plan, a plan that would have been developed with huge level of public consultation and a large amount of deliberation at local authority level based on advice of officials adopted by the members of the local authority. A developer brings a proposal to the local authority, probably engages in pre-planning consultation, submits the application, further information will have been sought. You could have another process going on 6 months where the issues try to be resolved, but the local authority planners at the end of the day decide that this isn't appropriate development to take place at a location. There is then an appeal made to Bord Pleanála, where the Bord Pleanála's inspector, having visited and looked at all the evidence, decides to uphold or to recommend that the local authority decision be upheld. Then you have a meeting with 3 representatives, 2 of which, who will remain unnamed, decide to overturn their own inspector and the local authority's decision with minimal information as to how they came to that, and quite possibly have never set foot in the county, never mind looked at the site in question. Do you see, and this isn't to cast any aspirations on any of the members, current or past, of the board, but do you see how there's a potential for corruption in that?
I completely reject any corruption kind of allegations.
I'm not suggesting that there has been. I'm saying, do you see how there is a need for greater accountability and transparency in terms of those type of decisions?
Well, first of all, we have a very clear code of conduct around any kind of connectivity. Board members exclude themselves from any local considerations or any connections they may have, and that is actually on the public record. On the question of whether 2 or 3 board members are making a decision, the board actually has, as you say, 3,000 cases to decide. We met in 2019, we met over 800 times as a board tribunal with multiple meetings going on. It's not practical for the board to actually be going out to every single site. That's why we have a team of 60 inspectors that gives us their views. We obviously look at not just the inspector's report, we actually look at all of the information provided, including the local authorities' observations, any state agencies that have made commentary, and indeed observers, submissions, etc. And on the basis of the collective expertise that the board has, and we have a range of skills, we're not just planners, we have architect engineers, we have archaeologists, we have administrators. That collective expertise is the system that we have designed by the Oireachtas to determine cases. In other jurisdictions, you have a single planning a commissioner up in the north, for example, as you probably know, and they're actually the ones that make their decisions in relation to an individual case.
I'm just looking with what we have in terms of Bord Pleanála, and it's just to ensure that the public can have absolute confidence. Because if you have a situation where 3 members of the board sit to adjudicate and 2 decide to overturn previous recommendations and 1 doesn't, well then that clearly creates the potential that were it another 3 or a different 3 members of the board, they could have come to a different decision. And again, that undermines the public confidence that these decisions are being made wholly on the basis of good planning practice. So my question is, do you think that there is scope to improve the accountability and transparency in relation to decisions of the board?
Well, we would certainly and that is one of our our existence, and indeed our reputation is based on transparency, accountability, and indeed I would challenge anybody to say that there is anything other than the proper consideration of all applications and appeals that come before us.
Thank you.
And I would just say that there is where the chair of myself, or indeed the chair of the meeting, can escalate any case that it considers to actually require a larger board. So there is that opportunity that if someone says, well, actually, I think this is a matter that should go to a larger board, obviously that is something that can be done. But again, we will always push and we will always press to improve and to ensure that there is both transparency and accountability within the